This is Leverage, the podcast about power, politics, and influence. I'm Kristal Taylor.
And I'm Breon Wells.
And today, twin, today is an important day in American history. It is a day in which we shall, henceforth, therefore, wherefore, I don't know. Look, we are.
I was rooting for you. I was rooting for you. I was like, where are we going in the Abraham Lincoln Escort?
I was about to start sounding like Dr. Seuss, and I had to let it go. I'm like, we gonna stop this tomfoolery now. But look, so we are about a little over a year and a half into the Biden administration, and as you will recall, there was great fanfare made early on, probably within his first 60 days of office, about this agenda for racial equity, right? We even had a fabulous executive order. Some new things happened. That's specific, right? But let's talk about it some, right? Let's talk about where we are now. Again, roughly 100 days or so away from midterm elections. If we were to have a report card, right, to prepare us for the midterms, right, to prepare us for the conversations we need to be having about racial equity in this country, specifically as pertains to Black people, right? Because there was a whole lot of action in 2020 on following George Floyd, the various uprisings, right? Like where are we now? Nearly two years, a little over 2 years from kind of the summer of racial reckoning, and about a year and a half in to the Biden administration. Where do we go on this report card for what has been going on for Black America with this report card? Where do we stand?
If I had to grade it today, twin, I'm feeling like grading it according to Facebook relationship status. I would say it's complicated. That's the relationship status. You see, it's complicated.
Stop it, but accurate.
It's not as easy. But
we have a Black VP.
And I didn't mean to laugh as in dismissing that, but yes, we have a Black VP. We had a Black president. We had, Black members, even Reconstruction, Hiram Rose Revel, and some of the other folks, they were Black in Congress. So, we have seen spaces where Black people have been in power to an extent. Mm-hmm. But the other reason why it's complicated is, that pesky old systemic and institutionalized racism and sexism and stuff that built all of the systems that these folks.
I was like, you mean the bedrock, the bedrock
the bedrock of stuff. We sweeping the porch, and if the porch is racism, we keep sweeping the porch and still trying to build on that porch. But what you're sitting on top of is the bedrock of things that were built. Yeah. So I think, though, to your point, right, we're a year and a half into Biden's administration. And I think that anyone who says it's too early to start contemplating about a grade needs to wake up and realize that the demands for racial equity have long been here. I think that there's a couple of things, though, on the politics side that we should keep in mind. One, 94% worth of Black people voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Now, what we can't say is that there was a vote for a specific policy piece. What we do know is vast majorities of people voted for Donald Trump, for Joe Biden as a check or a
not vote for Donald Trump.
That's right. As a pushback.
I know you ain't want to say it. But it's like, well, did they really vote for Uncle Joe, or were they just voting against Trump?
They were voting, and what we do know is sizable portions were at least voting against Trump. So we don't really have a policy metrics that has been coming from Black and brown people saying this in lump total is what we envision racial equity is looking at, that has been communicated in full to the government. But how we got here also matters. the Biden-Harris administration decided early on, before the inauguration, that they would list racial equity as one of their 4 key pillars. Now, the reason that some may take hope in it, but I say this adds to that complication, is I'm a firm believer that anytime you're talking about justice or equity, the directly impacted need to be leading in that work and need to be the voice that is articulating that. So to this point, we have racial equity that has been added by the Biden administration based on their outlook of what racial equity is. And, you know, they might be struggling, they are struggling, just like all private sector, you know, corporations that sat out there and wanted to give some words of encouragement and critique about George Floyd's murder, but weren't willing to do the internal digging to see how they as well might be adding to that culture and that climate of toxicity, that even though they didn't personally have that knee on that neck, how was it that we built this society there? So that needs to be said, that who put forth this vision of racial equity has everything to do with it. So, you know, it's complicated to grade something that I would say wasn't necessarily strongly articulated from the right voices in the first place. But we have, some would point to what has Biden done in his time, and we'll leave it to the viewers to decide whether that has aligned with your strategy and your vision of what racial equity is. There's been the American Rescue Plan Act, so ARPA, you know, which was kind of, as he was first coming in, dealing with this global pandemic that we're in and this economic downturn that was a result of the whole world having to shut down, including vast pockets of U.S. industries. That was not specifically for Black people, but there was, you know, there's some wiggle room if folks are nuanced to be able to try to point it towards imperatives. We had the For the People Act that was introduced into Congress to deal with voting rights, right? And electoral politics in some ways. Joe Manchin put a pin in that and was like, yeah, no. And so that has been offered in Congress, but has not been passed by Congress and has not been signed by this president. Still sits in the Senate. We had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. Remember that pesky conversation about BIB and BBB, and we were getting so caught up on what's the different acronyms and getting confused. There was a bipartisan infrastructure bill to deal with our roads and our bridges, but then the Biden administration was talking about human infrastructure and Build Back Better. Build Back Better still ain't been passed. They decided, Joe Manchin again was running the table. You know, hate to bring this up, but it reminds me, Twin, of when VP Harris was on Charlemagne's show, and he said, so
who's running it? Joe?
Right.
Who's running it? Who's really? Is it Joe Manchin or is it President Joe Biden?
I would have to say, the way this is looking, you know, it was laughed at that time. It's like, no, but we got an infrastructure bill, but that human infrastructure stuff, especially Build Back Better, that had to deal with human infrastructure, including Black and brown issues, is now being stalled potentially, and then has been watered down and piecemealed. So, you know, we're not looking too good. We discussed Build Back Better. Then
but wait, see, you being so policy oriented, right? Which we love. That's what we always are. Let me ask you simple things. Do we have because what are some of the issues, right? Let's talk about what are some of the issues.
Do we have protections in voting rights?
Do we have voting rights protections?
No.
Do we have
nope.
Do we have an increased minimum wage that is actually consistent with, say, the national housing wage, which better represents a living wage, which is actually closer to like $20, $22? Do we have that?
Nope.
Do we have more affordable health care? Because as somebody who participates in self-funded health care, Mama's pockets is tired. Mama's pockets is real tired.
We
Real
don't.
tired.
And to add, I one up you, twin, and we still have maternal mortality rates that are highest among women of color. And it's not solely attributed to if you had affordable health care. It's still dealing with that systemic and institutionalized racism and sexism, which also plays a physical toll while you're trying to carry a baby and produce life in this earth. And we apparently have decided to roll back rights for Roe v. Wade, which again does impact, not in the way people think, but does impact women of color in the highest. So no,
well,
we don't.
Okay, now since you open the door then for like Supreme Court decisions, I know we have a lot more protection now in terms of making sure that Black communities in particular are safeguarded from the effects of climate change and global warming.
No, and on that front, Black community, for the record, twin, as you know, is not talking about climate change. We're talking about environmental justice, which is a whole broader thing. So when we talk about policies that deal with climate change, you're talking about a narrowly specific white agenda. Not that there's not a need for it, but you can't put that in the bucket of racial equity and be like, see, we're doing stuff for you. Why don't you turn out for election?
How about with respect to police reform and accountability? We have some sort of federal standard now, right? That's going to curb and curtail police conduct, which disproportionately impacts Black people, either through how people are, incarcerated, how crimes are prosecuted,
no, Congress
how police and law enforcement. How police? No, right? Okay.
No, because Congress collectively said they'll pass. Not that there weren't elements that weren't fighting for it, but as a whole, Congress decided they pass on it. And then President Biden did do an executive order, but let's be clear. It's kind of hard for Black and brown folks to feel that accountability is being had when the Fraternal Order of Police and other lobbying interest groups that are the leaders of the police force and police unions helped write those things. It's kind of like letting Meta, the artist formerly known as Facebook, letting Meta dictate the terms of these privacy laws and write them as laws of themselves or write them as an executive order. Of course, they're going to favor themselves.
So then, okay, we do have extra healthcare and resources for veterans, right? Or no? That's what John Stewart was just getting on Congress about, with not actually passing legislation that would have made healthcare more affordable for veterans, many of whom are Black and brown, right? We missed out.
And let me just provide a little, because we have short-term memory sometimes. When we talk about systemic and institutionalized and structural racism, the New Deal that we all love to praise and even name after stuff after, that literally was almost like where we are today, where in order to get the New Deal passed, there were literal discriminatory racial elements in it for the appetite of some to be able to sign off on this bigger party. So the main portion of this is a lot of the things that you're asking about, twin, a lot of the policies that I read for were things that are and have always been vaguer, big issues that somehow, just like trickle down economics, don't quite trickle down to the folks that were supposed to get it. See? And so it makes it complicated to grade and say that the Biden administration is addressing racial equity or is doing it at its best that it can. And it even makes it harder, as the administration is struggling with, to now communicate to Black communities why they should turn out in 2022 And in case we missed the last poll, since we're on this politics beat, when remember when a couple of weeks ago, President Biden had put out that he's going to run again in 2024. And vast majorities of Democrats, not just Black people, but especially as well, Black people were like, no, Joe, don't. Please.
Don't tell him.
No. We don't. They're not feeling him. And so what we have here is at least an administration that has put up racial equity as their thing. But for so many reasons, somehow it is not translating both in substance and in communication to apparently Black voters, which is why there's all of this big thing about, will Black people turn out to vote in this election? We need you. We need you to come out now.
So I want to play devil's advocate a little bit, and I'm genuinely curious. I'm genuinely curious, right? When you go through this complicated report card, right, which is, of course, not to say that the Biden administration has done nothing that is beneficial to Black communities, right? So that's not what we're saying. However, when we look at this complicated track record of the last year and a half, what is it that you would say is the most effective way to demonstrate Black power in this moment? Is it that people sit out the elections and you just let whatever happen during the midterms? Or is now the time to come together differently with a very clear, direct, strategic Black agenda that addresses the variety of policy concerns that people have? Like, what's your take? What do you think would be most effective in this moment? How do you use power to create change?
Yeah, I think, and this is again just my opinion, I think that we need to learn from some of the missteps of 2020. Let's start with the victory. The victory is we had a lot of people that turned out to vote in the highest numbers that we've had. And that is strongly due to Black folks. Boom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, we already said that it was a vote against Trump instead of a vote for Biden. And I think that one of the missteps was that we stopped at, we don't want Trump, so let's just vote Biden in, without being detail-oriented, or as I often get accused of being, petty. You see what I'm saying? I prefer to call it detail-oriented, because the detail-oriented side in me would say, I'm a vote for Joe Biden as part of my strategy, but I'm not going to forget that he was the architect of the 1994 crime bill. And apology or not, the reality of that means, no, Biden, you don't get to dictate the terms of what equity looks like and racial equity. So that means after those elections, hence what our one of our last episodes that we talked about why Black people should vote, when it's most important as well what you do between elections. So this means when he said and put on that website, I'm doing this pull on racial equity, now hold on, this is not one of those kumbaya moments. We are now past the election. Biden, you needed to bring us in. Don't you put anything out talking about you doing racial equity until you talk to the community. Show me where the Black town halls were. Show me where the Latino American town halls were. Show me where these other things where you were, instead of being paternalistic, as we like to call it, and saying, I know better, and here's the constraints that we can deal with. Show us when you brought community in with the same heat that you was going out and seeking for our votes. So I'm saying that was too much leeway we gave him. I won't call it a misstep fully. I'll say that's some leeway we gave him to be able to articulate what racial equity looks like here, and then to be able to say, well, we did all these things, but it's just like the Juneteenth, which you and I discussed. So you gave us Juneteenth, but that's not what we asked for.
Ain't nobody asked for Juneteenth.
We didn't ask for that. And so
nobody asked for Juneteenth.
Right. We can't keep doing this thing where we say what we want, you give us not what we asked for, and then you expect us to go along to get along later. Like, you're in power now. To me, I think that facets of activists and civil society have been too accommodating. We can't keep living only by election. That means, look, you want to do these things, y'all are ill-equipped. Y'all are ill-equipped to be able to deal with these things. You need to bring more people in and talk. You know how to find our numbers and our information. Y'all sure enough got it off of Obama. He sold y'all all of the rights and the data, right? For where we are, where our phone numbers are. That's why y'all keep blowing up our phones and asking us to come out and vote. And have we put our plan on how we going to get to the voting location? Never mind our plan of accountability. So that's how we have to me, restart the conversation from the beginning, and who's leading that conversation, who is articulating what these things are. And then once we've level set that gives us a better vantage point to now say, here's what I've articulated. You have or have not met up to these things that we have clearly articulated.
So then politically speaking, right, over the next 90 days, 100 days or so, right, before people, maybe they do turn out to vote, maybe they don't, right? During the midterms, we'll see.
Right.
But it's like, what do you think needs to happen? And is there actually enough time to see a significant shift happen so that, one, there is that power shift in terms of recentering and reprioritizing whose voices are being focused on, whose voices and needs are being elevated? And then is there enough time between now and then to engage differently politically so that whatever the outcome is of these elections, people understand on day one, after folks get sworn in, we're going to move differently. This is what it looks like. This is how we engage in politics, not, again, so married to a partisan lens, but really focus on this is what power has to be if we want to see change happen. Is there enough time? And how do we start that process?
The answer is nuanced, right? Yes, there is enough time. There's no such thing as impossibility. But if you ask me the likelihood, nah, I'm not optimistic in the likelihood. It can happen. And I'll say a phrase that we know, and hear, but I'll say it differently. Old dogs refuse to learn new tricks. And that's why we will stay in the cycles, right?
Where I see how you said they refuse to learn new tricks. You ain't say you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Right.
You said old dogs refuse to learn.
And learn to change, but we hate change. And this is in part that nasty, truth that we don't like to talk about is some people, it's not even necessarily that they hold racial animus against somebody else. But what keeps them, and I ain't talking about Republicans, sometimes these independents and progressives and liberals, right, moderate liberals, is you love your status quo more than you love this talk of these other things.
Listen, or you just love your status more than you love.
That's right. And so and this is why I think that it was dangerous in part. It was necessary, but it was dangerous for Biden to use the term equity. You can't achieve, as I said and I've said other times, you can't achieve equity until you have satisfied justice. And so any of these things, like equity, is something that can be incrementally brought to bear. Justice, I'm not so convinced that that's something that incrementalism is ever the right tone for justice. When we owe a debt, Sally Mae, what's her new name now? Navient, you know what I mean? Navient.
I still don't like that heifer. Either way.
all of these things.
Used to call a Fannie Mae.
Right. When your debt collector comes to you, they're asking for that down payment, even if that down payment or that payment for that month is $3,000. They ain't asking and trying to help figure out, well, maybe you could do 50 cents. There's nothing incremental on that amount that is due at that time of what meets the moment. In the same way, justice says we have some hard decisions and reflections that we need to make, and justice can't be pursued conveniently and inconvenience.
And it
In
seems
fact,
like
it's
we're
going to
walking.
inconvenient you and cause for transformation.
Right.
And only then, once you satisfy that, you can start to envision what equity looks like. And a lot of these things have been trying to tiptoe around comfortabilities towards being around justice. We got a silhouette of justice in these things and no substance.
And to be perfectly honest, in so many ways, it feels like we are moving farther away from justice as the goal. When it's controversial to teach actual American history, like for real Black history, and the things that this country has done and continues to do, people like, there was all this hubbub, and still to some degree you hear it, right, around critical race theory, which in and of itself is like, we don't teach critical race theory in elementary school, right, middle school, or high school, but we're not going to go through that level of specificity. The underlying idea being that you can't even be honest about what has happened in this country. And you can't have justice absent honesty, because you can't have justice until there's some sort of acknowledgement and at least an attempt at atonement for what has been done. And so if you are at a point now where you are walking back reality, you can't even simply say, oh, this is what it is. How can you say that justice is even a metric when you can't even have a conversation on facts, not alternative facts, on actual facts? You can't even have that baseline conversation.
Yep. Watch how I do this, twin. So in the politics of it, we do believe, one, for the record, Joe Biden is not on the ballot box. Donald Trump is not on the ballot box, right? He's not on the ballot card.
Correct.
So because we're not at presidential elections, this election is about congressional seats and state legislatures and some of these other critical local and state spaces, which is very important and very critical. But the reason I say Biden, so Bidenism, Trumpism is on the ballot, even though those individuals are not. And so what we need to do is, again, vote. We talk about this often on this podcast. What is your strategy? What is the way you envision this world? And since Congress is the one that has the power of the purse and can make legislation, not the president, he or she gives forth their thoughts, their ideals, and they have an ability to veto, and that veto can be overridden, or they have ability to sign into law. And those things that they sign into law can be stymied at the local and state level, right, through implementation. But you need to figure out which of these congressional members in 2022 in your district, if you're voting for, you're on the state, one of those 1/3, Senates that are up for seats. If you're in those states where school board elections are happening, where governors and their sheriff that you are electing, and judges and these other spaces, these prosecutors, you need to figure out how do they align with this vision of equity, which means what's their stance when it comes to justice. That's the politics of it. Now, the power policy side says we really need to have a frank conversation about the difference between equality versus equity. And that is my pet peeve.
That's another conversation.
Folks continue to say, yeah, this gives us equality, like that is synonymous with equity. No. Equality is being seen as level and equal before the law. Equity is having stake, ownership, power shifting. You're talking about power when you're talking about equity. And that's why I say these things that the administration has done has in some ways been undermining the reality of what it takes for equity to be achieved, because they even in their mind still conflate equality and equity. Equity calls for a whole different set of things, which would mean that how you look at it even in policy might say you might have to have some legislation that is more ethnic centric and racially centric. Because if you're trying to satisfy justice, you didn't screw everybody the same way in a blanket way. So you can't provide a blanket Band-Aid and then be like, hey, aren't y'all happy? You're going to have to go back, and there's a tax for each and every individual community that you at that time decided to silence.
Look, I'm going to say, let's make it even more basic. Let's take page from the book of South Africa post-apartheid. Can we just get a Truth and Reconciliation Council? I mean, start there.
Right.
Start there, because you can't calculate actual damages. You can't calculate material harm and like the benefits that I mean, you can. People have definitely put figures to it, but it helps to at least have common agreement and understanding on what happened, who was aggrieved, and what the consequences have been from there. Like, I mean, just that one thing alone, just that one thing alone, and I think people get caught up, Congress gets caught up because, for what, 40 years now, there's been conversation around the possibility of a study for reparations. If y'all caught up on the word, don't call it reparations. This could be our Truth and Reconciliation Council. Let's have that. We had a series of hearings on the January 6th insurrection. Okay, lots of investigative proceedings as to what happened, who was behind what, who was injured, who was conspiring, y'all. We could study. We could do a commission. We could have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a foundational starting point for some of the redress that can and should be explored by not only this administration but others.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Twin. I think, though, the other part that we have to mention is we're not dealing with folks at every level of government that are altogether naive. Part of what they do, even and let's break it down to layman's terms. How many times have we in the Black community heard from people that are not Black, but specifically white folks, I'll never know what it is to be Black and to deal with this and that. You might not know what it is to specifically per se be Black, but you do know what it is to encounter an injustice. And we've seen how you act out when you feel that there is an injustice that has been done. So I often find that the reason they wordsmith is intentional. The reason they birth these commissions is intentional, because it's a delay tactic in and of itself, because after we finish studying, then we want to have a study about another study, and then we want to do this peer review. And then after we've done the peer review, we say, well, who else is saying these things? And they aren't saying anything. So now we need another commission to do these, because at the end of the day, you're scared to actually act on what you know, because it's about to shift the power dynamic.
What would be one of the most fundamental shifts that we could see if we had legislation that placed, call it 5 years, 10 years, however long, but placed a moratorium. It's a lot to say, but a moratorium on the accrual of interest rates on credit, on loans. And, what I'm saying? Imagine how many people would be liberated if they didn't have to worry about the interest rates ranging anywhere from like 10, 20, upwards of 30% sometimes, right, on their credit cards or student loans or personal loans, whatever the case may be. Like, just that one thing would have such a dramatic impact. And yes, it would perhaps benefit Black people disproportionately, but other people would benefit from that too. Like, that's the thing. It's like, we have to get away from this idea sometimes, I think, in this country, that if you do something for Black people, that other people don't benefit as well. I have never seen anything done with Black people in mind, with any person of color in mind, that did not inure to the benefit of the broader society that we live in. So it's like, y'all, come.
But there is no need for genuine logic and rationality when self-preservation, in its most limited term, is the window with which you view the world. So, I mean, and I think I, again, don't disagree with you, Twin, but I think I'd be remiss if I said that path that you suggest, which I'm all for, would force us to have to reevaluate even the economic espousals and, narratives and truths or non-truths that we hold conveniently for this system, to work. And that presents, I think this is why, and this is the last thing I'll say then, this is why when we talk about equity, to me, it forces us to have to wrestle with reform versus transformation. Because a lot of what scares some people, again, is not that everybody is out there just specifically saying, I don't want Black or brown people to thrive. But what they are saying very clearly is, if I have to go back to the starting wheel and we have to deal with transformation, where does that leave me? So I'd rather cleave to the space where I know where my spot is and I have a chance to get ahead, even if it's at the expense of Black and brown people, then I will, in trying to imagine what something is new. We love to use the rhetoric of transformation, but we think in terms of reform. And you will only get as far as your mentality, not your rhetoric, as your mentality is. And so, I think that folks should start earnestly thinking. Those that are concerned with racial equity, I think, don't wait till the election. Actions are happening now by members of Congress and by these state legislatures who are up for a ballot and on the ballot in 2022 that affect your everyday lives. See how they're governing themselves. And if they're not governing themselves in a way that works for you and your vision of racial equity, I don't care even if they did offer pieces of legislation with the title racial equity on it. Find you a friend that is astute in policy that can tell you, well, wait a minute, this is the real. So you may want to keep that in mind as you go to the ballot box. But by all means, please show up to the ballot box with a strategy. No one gets wiggle room. Nobody should ever get any leeway. Why? Because there's nothing more precious than your freedom and your ability to have equity. So that means that the lens through which you grade all politicians, all elected officials who are supposedly speaking for you should be very tight. It ought to be something that they know they have to earn.
That's something we should do, Twin. Like when we talk about the ways that people can leverage their influence personally, right, to affect change in not only their lives, but in the lives of their communities. I think the one-off, it's one thing to tell people, like, investigate, look, learn. We should actually like kind of map out, and this is how you do it. This is what it looks like. So that'll be a future conversation. Look, as will justice and transformation. We'll also do like a equity map, right? How you do an equity map ahead of these here midterm elections.
Absolutely. Well, again, sorry we couldn't give an A minus, a D, or an F.
I think grading it by Facebook status was appropriate. Yep, it's complicated. It's complicated.
But the reason we graded it like that is because the ball is in your court, voters. This changes if you determine that you're really sick and tired of it and that you want change. And that change only happens as much as you want it to. If you want incremental and limited change, there it is. If you want more turning over all the tables and rethinking things, that has its own set of realities that I would say some could make the argument is worth it to make, depending on your strategy. But the ball is in your court on how you're going to grade them and what you're going to do in this upcoming midterm and these other elections that deal with how they are plugging forth to build the world that you envision.
Look, it's like I always say, democracy only works if you work it.
Work it.
And that's on what? What's that?
Mary had a little lamb.
Mary had a little lamb. Until next time, Twin. Bye.
Bye.
This is Leverage, the podcast about power, politics, and influence. I'm Kristal Taylor.
And I'm Breon Wells.